Our Sid was having a tough time at school. It wasn't the lessons. He was doing kind of okay with the lessons. The problem was Bert, or Basher, as he was known to his friends. See, Basher took every opportunity to laugh at and to bully and to humiliate Sid as much as he possibly could. We ever known anybody like that? Either when we were at school, or maybe in the workplace, or where we grew up. I think a lot of us have been there, haven't we? We've known a basher. It made Sid so unhappy. And the thing was, this is the thing with bullies, somehow they managed to do it and then make it look to the teacher as though you're the one who's done something wrong and you're the one who ends up in trouble. So Sid kept on getting into trouble because he reacted or turned back against Bert. He was so unhappy that every morning he did not want to go to school. But something bright was on the horizon. A school trip was coming up. Sid would be able to get away from Bert for a whole week. It was going to be great. His mum brought him along. She took him to the school bus. Yes, buses look like that in Grimo. She took him along. She took him to the school bus. He got on, he sat down next to one of his friends and he thought, great, I'm going to get away for a week. Then, guess who came and got on the bus? Bert. And as he walked along, he looked at Sid and he said, I hope your mum is giving you plenty of pocket money. You're going to need it to keep me happy this week. Sid just wanted to cry. We'll come back to Sid a little later. Let's have a look at 1 Samuel chapters 24. We're going to look at chapters 24 and 26. So we're going to jump 25 at the moment. As we see two very similar incidents in these two chapters. So 1 Samuel chapter 24 to begin with. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. The men said, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish." Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Afterwards, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lift up a hand against him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." With these words, David rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went on his way. Then David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, "My lord the king!" When Saul looked behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He said to Saul, "Why do you listen to men? Why do you listen when men say, 'David is bent on harming you'? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord gave you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lift my hand against my master, because he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, look at this piece of your robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but I did not kill you. Now understand and recognize that I am not guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me. But my hand will not touch you. As the old saying goes, from evildoers come evil deeds, so my hand will not touch you. Against whom has the king of Israel come out? Whom are you pursuing? A dead dog? A flea? May the Lord be our judge and decide between us. May he consider my cause and uphold it. May he vindicate me by delivering me from your hand. When David finished saying this, Saul asked, "Is that your voice, David, my son?" And he wept aloud. "You are more righteous than I," he said. "You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. You have just now told me of the good you did to me. The Lord gave you into my hands, but you did not kill me. When a man finds his enemy, does he let him get away unharmed? May the Lord reward you well for the way you treated me today. I know that you will surely be king, and the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. Now swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's family." So David gave his oath to Saul. Then Saul returned home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. And then chapter 26. The Ziphites went to Saul at Gibeah and said, "Is not David hiding in the hill of Hachilah, which faces Jeshimon?" So Saul went down to the desert of Ziph with his 3,000 chosen men of Israel to search there for David. Saul made his camp beside the road on the hill of Hachilah, facing Jeshimon. But David stayed in the desert. When he saw that Saul had followed him there, he sent out scouts and learned that Saul had definitely arrived. Then David set out and went to the place where Saul camped. He saw where Saul and Abner, son of Ner, the commander of the army, had laid down. Saul was laying inside the camp with the army encamped around him. David then asked Ahimelech the Hittite, Abishai, son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, "Who will go down to the camp with me to Saul?" "I'll go with you," said Abishai. So David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there Saul was lying asleep inside the camp with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. Abner and the soldiers were lying around him. Abishai said to David, "Today God has given your enemy into your hands. Now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of my spear. I won't strike him twice." But David said to Abishai, "Don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? As surely as the Lord lives," he said, "the Lord himself will strike him. Either his time will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. Now get the spear and water jug that are near his head and let's go." So David took the spear and water jug near Saul's head and they left. No one saw or knew about it, nor did anyone wake up. They were all sleeping because the Lord put them into a deep sleep. Then David crossed over to the other side and stood on top of the hill some distance away. There was a wide space between them. He called out to the army and to Abner, son of Ner, "Aren't you going to answer me, Abner?" Abner replied, "Who are you that calls to the king?" David said, "You're a man, aren't you? And who is like you in Israel? Why didn't you guard your lord the king? Someone came to destroy your lord the king. What you have done is not good. As surely as the Lord lives, you and your men deserve to die, because you did not guard your master, the Lord's anointed. Look around you. Where are the king's spear and water jug that were near his head?" Saul recognized David's voice, said, "Is that your voice, David, my son?" David replied, "Yes, it is, my lord the king." And he added, "Why is my lord pursuing his servant? What have I done, and what wrong am I guilty of? Now let my lord the king listen to his servant's words. If the Lord has incited you against me, then may he accept an offering. If, however, men have done it, May they be cursed before the Lord. They have now driven me from my share in the Lord's inheritance and have said, go serve other gods. Now do not let my blood fall to the ground far from the presence of the Lord. The king of Israel has come out to look for a flea as one hunts a partridge in the mountains. Then Saul said, I have sinned. Come back, David, my son, because you considered my life precious today. I will not try to harm you again. Surely I have acted like a fool and have erred greatly. Here is the king's spear, David answered. Let one of your young men come over and get it. The Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and faithfulness. The Lord gave you into my hands today, but I would not lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. As surely as I valued your life today, so may the Lord value my life and deliver me from all trouble. Then Saul said to David, may you be blessed, my son David, and you will do great things and surely triumph. So David went on his way, and Saul returned home. As I looked through these chapters and read some of the commentaries on them, it dawned on me there's a key verse in there. And it's the question that David asks of Saul. Chapter 26, verse 19. David says to Saul, why are you doing this? If the Lord has incited you, may he accept an offering. If, however, men have done it, may they be cursed. To paraphrase, it's saying, if God has told you to pursue me, well then I confess my sin and I'll give an offering and I'll seek forgiveness from God for whatever wrong I've done. But Saul, if people have persuaded you to chase me down, well then it's them who are the sinners, not me. It's saying, Saul, whose voice are you listening to? God's or men's? And it presents a question for us. Who do we listen to? Whose voice is strongest in influencing us in our decisions and our thoughts? David was twice encouraged to listen to the voices of the world. The same kind of voices that we probably very often hear in our lives. Try and picture the scene in chapter 24. Picture how chapter 24 would be played out in a film. David has taken his men into a cave. In this part of the world there were some huge caves that they were naturally large anyway, but then the local farmers would make them even bigger, that they would dig into the back really, really deep to create shelter where they could take their livestock. David knew about them. He knew about these really deep caves where you could take livestock. It's where David used to take some of his sheep and take them to find shelter when they were needed. God had been preparing David for this time all the way through his life. This cave was so deep and so dark, it was dark enough to hide 600 fighting men. So David hides the back of the cave in the dark. Saul, with his 3,000 highly trained soldiers, come up to the front of the cave. Just give me a minute, or maybe two, Saul says. I just need to step inside. While he's in there, either relieving himself or sleeping, depending on which translation you read, David's men start to encourage him. Go on, now's your chance. He's been hunting you down. He wants to kill you. He's your enemy. Go on. God has given him into your hands. Is that what we would think in this situation? Is that what we'd have encouraged David to do? Go on. Now's your chance. He's hunting you. He's trying to kill you. David creeps up behind him. So try and picture it as if it's in a film. He creeps up slowly, knife in hand. Dramatic music starts to play. He's right up close behind Saul. He reaches out for the knife. We all know what's about to happen. Except it doesn't. Cuts a bit off his robe. Sneaks back. Everybody's shocked. Why did David do that? Why didn't he listen to the advice of the people around him? Maybe they felt a little bit like some of the people in this little scene that some of you might have seen on television in the 1980s. Is that what his men were thinking when he cut off a bit of his robe and turned around rather than sticking a knife in Saul? What are you doing? Meanwhile, Sid is settling into his school trip. Day one, there's a high ropes adventure. Some of you have done high ropes things, haven't you? And you have to climb up a rope ladder and it's all a little bit dodgy. And Sid was busy climbing up the ladder. Here we are, all the best old-age talks have a ladder in somewhere, don't they? And Sid was busy climbing up the ladder. Am I going to get this to stand? No, I'm not. He was climbing, he got halfway up the rope. And any of you ever climbed up rope ladders? They don't feel very sturdy, do they? They start to wobble a little bit and he got halfway and he was moving and his legs were shaking and his arms went wobbly and he didn't know what to do. And he said, I can't go on, I can't move. He was stuck, paralysed with fear, unable to go up, unable to go down. Bert looks up at him. Look, he's stuck. Everybody look at him. He's scared. Oh, he's starting to cry. Baby, baby Sid. And he got all the others joining in. Baby, baby Sid. It took quite a while for one of the leaders to climb up with a harness and help Sid come down. People laughing at him the whole time. He hated being there. He hated Bert. He just wanted to go home. Next day, however, there was canoeing. Sid was actually quite good. He'd been canoeing before. And a couple of times when the instructor was getting somebody to show the others how to turn the canoe round or do different things, he used Sid as the example, and Sid started to feel a little bit better. All of a sudden, there was a huge splash. Sid looked round and Bert's canoe was upside down. He was clinging to the top of his canoe, shouting, "Help, I can't swim! Somebody come and get me!" Sid was the closest. He paddled over. And he heard the voices of his friends. "Come on, Sid, push him in. Go on, you know he'd push you in. Go on, push him in the water. Let's see if he can swim." See, that's the voice of the world, isn't it? This is what the world would tell us to do, like David's soldiers urging him to kill Saul. The world will tell us we've got a right to take revenge on somebody who hurts us. People will even quote the Bible to you, won't they? An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, without really understanding what the verse means. Chapter 26, David has a very similar experience. He creeps into Saul's camp this time. Abishai said, "Let me kill Saul." Look, God's even provided the spear right there next to everything set up. I can just pin him to the ground. David still wasn't listening to the voices around him, no matter how persuasive they were. That's what David is asking about Saul in verse 19. So have you been listening to the voices around you? Have you been listening to people urging you on to do this? Because David knew that such voices, the voices of the world, will always lead us to do wrong. Just as they led Adam and Eve to sin all those years before, they will lead us to sin and to do wrong. Maybe Saul had been listening to a different voice. Maybe it wasn't just other people whose voice he'd been hearing. Maybe Saul had been listening to a little voice inside himself, urging him on. Like the next voice that Sid heard. See, Sid heard the voices of the people around him telling him to push him in. As he rode and as he got closer to Bert, he started to hear a voice that came from inside. A voice saying, Bert hurt you. He made your life a misery. You've got every right now to go and push him in, Sid. Go on. He wanted to. Oh, he ached to push Bert in the water and make him pay for all the wrong that he'd done. Well, we'll come back later and find out what Sid did. But that's the voice that Saul maybe was listening to. See, we know that David only had 600 men with him. His 600 men were not highly trained, professionally equipped soldiers. They were a disparate group of people who'd been on the run for some time. And yet at the start of chapter 24, verse 2, Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel to hunt down David. So Israel was at war with the Philistines. They had enemies all around them. Saul's job as the king was to protect God's nation. And yet he took 3,000 of the best soldiers away from protecting the nation to go and chase down David. He was obsessed with getting David. I'm not so sure that he'd been put up to this by voices around him. I think his army advisors are far more likely to have encouraged him to shore up the defensive positions around Israel's borders than to go off chasing David. I wonder if Saul was listening to that voice that so often drives us to defend ourselves against other people, driven on by pride or fear or obsession. When somebody hurts us, we don't always need other people to urge us on to act defensively or to verbally attack another person. We all too often just do that and we retaliate without even thinking about it. And when we get that opportunity for revenge, when we get that opportunity to point out somebody else's errors, to hit them with a comment that we know will hurt. People around us, we know the things that would really hurt them if we say them. When we get that opportunity, it can be so hard to resist if they've hurt us. Everything inside us is telling us that we have the right to. It's okay. It's a righteous anger that you feel. It's their fault anyway. When we do that, when we give in to that voice inside urging us to do that, does it make things better or worse? Does it help the situation or do things start to go downhill? What does it do for the gospel message that we want to share with others? How is that affected when people see us retaliate against others? David shows us a third way. Listening to God rather than to other people or that voice that drives us on to take revenge. Sid got closer and closer to Bert. He reached out his oar and pushed it towards Sid. Everybody thought he was going to push Sid in. Just like they thought that David was going to stick a knife in Saul. Like Del Boy thought that Rodney was going to grab the gun. Everybody was poised, thinking, here we go. Sid's going to push him in. This is going to be fun to watch. Sid shouted, grab my oar, Bert. And he pulled him into his own canoe. Like David so many years earlier, he listened to God's voice. And he did what was right. I'm going to try and show you 3 ways, quickly, that we see David doing what is right and listening to God. The first is he maintains a respect for God-given authority. In chapter 24, verse 5, after cutting off part of Saul's robe, he could have put a knife in Saul there. He didn't. He just cut a bit off the robe. And yet, even for doing that, we see him conscience-stricken because he damaged Saul's robe, a sign of Saul's authority as king. David had humiliated him. He's indicated perhaps that Saul's authority had been severed. It was a mark of extreme disrespect. David knew the things that the Bible had told him about this. Exodus 22, God said, do not blaspheme God or curse the ruler of your people. It's interesting how those 2 things are included together in the same verse. By disrespecting a person that God has given authority to, actually we disrespect our Creator God. As with so many Old Testament verses, that the New Testament takes them and amplifies them. It gives them extra meaning. Romans 13. Give to everybody what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honour, then honour. We are to respect and honour those who God has ordained to govern. David knew that. He could have killed Saul, but he chose not to. He even regretted the act of cutting off Saul's robe. The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lift my hand against him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. We don't have to agree with the policies or the decisions of those who are given authority, whether they're politicians, whether they're bosses at work, even if they're traffic wardens. We don't have to agree with their decisions in a situation, but we respect them because God has appointed them to those positions. David knew that, which is why he refused to kill Saul, even regretted actions that could have caused Saul humiliation. And secondly, David allowed room for God's vengeance. We often feel warranted in acting against other people because of what they have done to us. David knew that Saul had wronged him. He makes no pretense that it's all okay. He doesn't say, it doesn't matter what Saul did. He doesn't pretend that what Saul had done was okay or didn't happen. But he chose not to take revenge by killing him or even taking him captive. By the standards of his day, nobody would have thought him wrong for killing the man who tried several times to take his life. But he chose not to. And in so doing, it gives us an insight into what forgiveness really is. The Bible tells us not to take revenge. God says, it is mine to avenge. I will repay. Again, the New Testament amplifies that. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. David allowed God to deal with Saul. And this is forgiveness pictured for us. Forgiveness doesn't say it's okay. Forgiveness doesn't say it's okay what you did. I don't mind what you did. Forgiveness is very honest about the wrong that people do to us. It acknowledges the hurt. If you look at chapter 26, verses 19 and 20, you can feel David's pain in there. He knows he's been wronged. Saul, why are you doing that? Why have you wronged me like this? There's pain in those words. He doesn't hide it. He doesn't say it's okay. But in chapter 24, verse 12, he says, but the Lord will judge between you and me. The Lord will avenge the wrongs you have done. Forgiveness says you have done wrong, you have hurt me, but I choose to treat you as though you hadn't. That's real forgiveness. And that's what God does for us. It's a picture of God's forgiveness. When we come to God with real repentance in our hearts for the wrong that we've done, when we come trusting that Jesus died for our sins, God doesn't say, it's okay. It's okay what you did. It doesn't matter. He says your sin was wrong, but Jesus paid for it on a cross. It was wrong and it deserved punishment. It deserved death, but Jesus died in your place. I'm not going to hold your sin against you. It's been paid for. Then God says to us, now go and forgive others as I've forgiven you. Being a Christian is always about changing to become more and more like Jesus. Forgiveness is part of that changing heart that God longs to give us. Both times that David allowed Saul to live, Saul appears genuinely sorry in that moment. I know he keeps going back to his wrong ways again. Straight after the incident in the cave with the cut robe, he says, I'm sorry, I've done wrong. But he's there chasing him again 2 chapters later. But in that moment, he does appear genuinely sorry. And forgiveness is far more likely to achieve a positive result than taking revenge. Taking revenge just makes a situation worse. It spirals out of control. I wonder how Bert might have responded to Sid saving him. May not have changed his whole life in that one moment. Oh, I'm going to give up being a bully because you've pulled me out of the water. But would Sid pushing him in have made things any better in the long run? Probably not. Let's choose to be like David. Choose to forgive, but leave it to God. Those things that have been done against us. And finally, David trusted God. Saul came to the very cave where David and his men were hiding. It could have been an absolute massacre, 3,000 against 600. But God saved them. When David crept into the camp, if one of them had woken and sounded the alarm, it would have ended badly for David. But God kept Saul's men asleep. I like the way David mocks Abner, Saul's bodyguard, for not keeping him safe. Yet Saul had 3,000 men, and yet David could have killed him twice. David didn't have 3,000 men around him. He had God. And God was far more effective than a 3,000 strong army. Part of the reason that we so often act aggressively when somebody hurts us is because we feel we've got to protect ourselves. We've got to protect ourselves now and against future hurts. But God actually is far better equipped to protect us than we are to defend ourselves. We can trust him. When we learn to listen to God's voice, rather than to the voices around us, or to that burning desire in our own hearts for revenge, we'll start to be more like God, more like Jesus. We will respect the authorities that God has put in place. We'll learn to start forgiving others, leaving room for God to act. And we'll learn to trust him for our future peace and security.